Good afternoon from beautiful Barcelona. I am Alexis, CEO of SciTech DiploHub, the Barcelona Science and Technology Diplomacy Hub. Thank you so much for joining us one more week at this series of online seminars on science diplomacy and the COVID-19 pandemic that SciTech DiploHub has put forward together with other world-class institutions and leading international specialists in geopolitics, technology, science diplomacy, and global health. Today, we will address the role of new technologies in advancing global health, its geopolitical implications, and the impact of digital strategies on data privacy, civil rights, and the spreading of misinformation. The coronavirus pandemic is accelerating innovation in the tech scene. The current health emergency presents new challenges not only of scope, but of speed. For instance, digital technologies that were unavailable just a few years ago are helping millions around the world to keep on working while helping public authorities to fight the virus. We are witnessing the involvement of major tech actors as well, who are exploring and exploiting the potential of big data, artificial intelligence, and other emerging technologies in predicting, monitoring, and preventing the adverse effects of COVID-19. Contact tracing, for example, is likely to be a core component of exit strategies out of COVID-19 lockdowns and has already proved successful in countries such as Singapore, Taiwan, and South Korea. While the emergency adds urgency and legal legitimacy for such applications, protecting privacy and civil liberties will remain essential. On the other hand, major attempts to regulate digital content and halt the spread of misinformation have been initiated by both national governments and major tech companies such as Facebook and Google. Considering this context, how relevant is technological capacity to fight the pandemic, and what is the geopolitical impact of these new technologies? Will COVID-19 widen the digital divide between the developed and developing countries? What should be the terms of any partnerships between government and major tech companies? Can we reconcile data protection and public health? Will COVID-19 lead us to new norms of privacy and surveillance in the longer term? How is misinformation spreading during this pandemic? To shed light on some of these issues, today we are delighted to welcome 4 world-class experts in innovation policy, cyber diplomacy, and data protection and network analysis, who will be moderated by Esther Paniagua, award-winning science and technology journalist and editor. Esther, good afternoon. Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this very interesting panel.
The floor is yours, Esther.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Alexis, for your intro and for hosting this session, addressing really important issues. Just to provide a bit more context, although you have already done it. On one hand, it turns out that our main strategy to deal with the pandemic comes from the 17th century, when lockdown became the template to fight this kind of public health issue. And on the other hand, quoting the Wall Street Journal, this is the first global pandemic in an age of ubiquitous smartphones. So this has meant governments now have surveillance capabilities unimaginable during prior outbreaks. Data flowing from the world's 5.2 million smartphones could help identify who, where, and how people get infected to contain the spread of the virus and minimize the sources of infection. But we don't know yet if they work. Alexis was talking before about these contact tracing apps. And it really, you need a critical mass to achieve the effectiveness of these applications. In Singapore, they have already checked that it's not % of population that was downloading the app. So that's one of the challenges these apps presents, of course, not to mention all the privacy issues around them and the debate around centralized or decentralized app. So yeah, while the emergency as urgency, as Alexis said, and legal legitimacy kind of for such applications is essential to protect privacy. On the other hand, we have information and communication technologies that are being employed to enhance traditional epidemic control and response measures, as well as for the development of innovative solutions by corporations, government, and civil society groups. From robots automating and multiplying PCR testing to digital manufacturing, 3D printing, drones or infrared cameras to monitor public areas, and all sorts of AI applications. All of these may have questionable uses. There's another problem. We have countless technologies that could help, but they are not always ready in many cases, and also they require infrastructure and procedures for making them interoperable, and efficient do not exist. So the pandemic has triggered a demand for new technological solutions, perhaps exacerbating technological solutionism, and also a demand for technologies to help us deal with the lockdown. For example, telework, telemedicine, online education, home delivery, etc. So digitalization is being accelerated while revealing notable differences between countries when it comes to available infrastructure to cope with all the challenges and needs of the moment. Last but not least, we are witnessing an avalanche of COVID-19 misinformation and disinformation, especially on social media platforms and instant messaging apps. This is not only undermining people's trust and violating their right to information, but also a cybersecurity risk, as well as a potential weapon for governments to censor information that is not coming from official sources. To address all of these topics, hopefully we have time. We have exceptional speakers. Let me introduce them. We have Katharina Höne, senior researcher on diplomacy and new technology at DiploFoundation. We also have Xavier Ferràs, associate professor at the ESADE Business School in the Department of Operations Management, Innovation and Data Sciences. And we have Kathleen, Carley, professor in the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University, is also the director of the Center of Informed Democracy and Social Cybersecurity and the Center of Computational Analysis and Social and Organizational Systems cases. So we were also going to have here joining us Elizabeth Brainiers from the Berkeley for Internet and Society at Harvard University, but she is finally not able to join us due to family issues. So we will perhaps miss that conversation about contact tracing apps, but there are many other interesting issues to address. So again, welcome all. I will start the questions with Katharina. Beyond contact tracing apps, all kinds of technologies to better navigate the COVID-19 pandemic are being developed and deployed. So how are countries redefining their national digital strategies? And how does COVID-19 challenge the traditional governance structures and diplomatic services around the world? Where does Europe fit in alongside US and China? Well, that was, I pretended to make this a question, but I know it's many issues, but perhaps to summarize in 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. And I'm really happy to be here also with the other distinguished speakers. So Esther, it's a very broad question, so I'm going to break it down a bit, and I'm going to try to do it justice as much as possible. But I think lots of these issues we will have to take up in the Q&A. So let me emphasize 2 points as a kind of broad overview. First, we have to distinguish between, if you talk about contact tracing, for example, between lots of different applications, taking lots of different approaches, as you said, centralized, decentralized, different technologies being used, the apps being compulsory or not compulsory. So it's really a broad field. And the other thing that I think we need to distinguish from the start when we talk about national digital strategies is this question between emergency response on the one hand and longer term strategies. And obviously the key concern here is that emergency response then suddenly becomes something longer term. And then to become more concrete, let me kind of move from the country level to the international level. So starting at the country level and national digital strategies, let me make 3 points. First point is related to Western countries. And I think apart from contract tracing apps and all the questions that these apps are raising, Western countries kind of have to realize that in many cases there are gaps in their digital strategies or gaps in the implementation of these strategies. And what I particularly have in mind here are that government agencies might not have been as well prepared as they should have been in digital terms, in terms of moving their services online, providing access for people, providing information in a digital way. So that for me is one of the key lessons and challenges for Western countries coming out of this. For countries from the global South, obviously one of the big concerns is the digital divide and the impact of the digital divide. For example, the WTO just a couple of days ago really emphasized this point. And for example, while in Western countries, it was relatively easy to move education online to a certain extent with all the challenges. Some countries don't have the luxury to move their education online or to have enough people in the population who can access such efforts in education. So that's a real challenge. Everything associated associated with the digital divide, from e-commerce all the way to. And then there's a third point when it comes to national digital strategies, and that's basically this question of how can we make sure that emergency measures stay emergency measures and don't become kind of long-term measures that somehow kind of creep in. So in other words, how can some of these measures be taken back? And we've seen many civil society organizations, Access Now is just one of them, calling for so-called sunset clauses, meaning that all the things related, for example, to data that are implemented now as an emergency measure are taken back in time. Personally, my hope is that because we have a debate on privacy and data more openly now, that civil society is becoming more active in these areas. Regarding perhaps the European Union, if we jump one level up, it's interesting because all European countries, or almost all European countries, have completely different applications and follow often different approaches to contact tracing, for example. At the same time, there is a sense that the EU tries to provide some kind of coherence. And obviously, when the new Commission President Ursula von der Leyen came into office, one of the key pillars of her term was digital issues. And so obviously, there's a sense that there's a push for digital transformation at the European level in terms of e-health, digital education, e-government, data sharing, broadband connectivity, etc., etc. And there's also push for some kind of common approach, some data sharing within the European Union. Perhaps one of the key documents there is a document the EU published in mid-April, and it's basically, it's called a Common EU Toolbox for Member States, Mobile Applications to Support Contact Tracing in the EU's Fight Against COVID-19. Let me just mention some of the key points. That the key points are: national apps should be voluntary. They should be approved by national health authorities. They should be privacy preserving. Personal data should be securely encrypted. And these apps should be dismantled as soon as they are no longer needed, going back to my earlier point. Global, international level, I could say a lot about how diplomatic practice has changed. I'm going to leave that for the discussion if people are interested in that. Just one quick observation before I'm going to finish is in terms of changes to global governance. One thing that for me is really noticeable is that we cannot avoid the private sector. So governments cannot avoid having conversations with the private sector and collaborating with the private sector, especially when it comes to contract tracing apps. So for example, Apple and Google have announced that they only support contract tracing apps that follow a decentralized approach. And by doing so, they obviously kind of narrow the options for governments to a certain extent and potentially influence implementation and policy. At the level of international organizations, we've also seen some interesting examples regarding this kind of collaboration between the private sector and international organizations. But I'm going to stop here, and I'm looking forward to follow-up questions to get into these points a little bit more in detail during our discussion.
Yeah, I actually have much more questions, but yeah, I will contain myself. So let's continue with the geopolitical aspects related to technological capacity in the light of COVID-19. Xavier, are countries geopolitically repositioning themselves in this regard? Which countries are really on the edge of deploying their own digital operational infrastructures to address the pandemic? And what can we learn from their successes and failures?
Okay, thanks for inviting me here. It's a pleasure. In fact, I have characterized the response to COVID-19 as something like the 3Ds, at least the initial response. I would say discipline in Asia, lack of coordination or disorder, if you want, in Europe, and Darwinism in the Atlantic bloc, basically in the United States and the United Kingdom. I think the three blocs have responded accordingly to three ways of understanding how science and how technology is managed. I think in Asia we have seen discipline, not only in China, that is an autocracy, but also in democracies like South Korea, Taiwan, or Japan. I would say that Korea is maybe the best example. After China released the genetic code, immediately the government created a kind of groups in order to, with the whole value chain in biotech and the digital cluster, to give solutions in the term of 1 month. So for the biotech cluster, they said we need kits for all the population, not only to develop those kits, but also to scale them up at industrial scale for serve the population. So the response is very great, very rapid, very disciplined, and completely in beating technology. And if you look at the statistics, South Korea or Japan are leading countries that have exceeded 3% of R&D over GDP. That was, in fact, the goal for the European Union for 2020. We are far away in Spain or Italy, for instance, to this goal. And those are countries in Asia that are very, very steep in science and a kind of purpose-oriented science. So I think those are the examples. In Europe, with also successful responses, say, for instance, Germany or Austria, that also are countries with high technological intensity. They have also done the homework in the European Union. They have almost crossed the frontier of 3% R&D over GDP, from which is a fundamental frontier to see whether a country is competitive and is well prepared for the future or not. And in the tail, unfortunately, we find Italy and Spain with very low R&D intensity, the lowest among advanced economies, and we have suffered the most. Also, Europe is fragmented, and there has been a lack of coordination and solidarity. If you want, afterwards, we can talk about this kind of digital divide also within Europe. And finally, in the United States, we have seen Darwinism, at least at the beginning. The United States is a country with a high level of technology, also a high technological intensity, but it's a very unequal country. The most maybe technological advanced, but also one of the most unequals among the advanced economies. There are more than 100 million people that are poor, almost excluded from the system, even in this country that is basically creating technological abundance. And maybe the situation could be dangerous there. I think we can also discuss it later, but maybe the world is shifting from North America, from the States, to basically fundamentally to China. So there are the conclusions about how different, not only countries, but also continents or blocks, geographical blocks have faced this pandemic.
Really interesting. So my conclusion from what you just said is that R&D intensity is key in terms of many things, but in this case, to be prepared better prepared for a pandemic like this one that we're living now. I have just a small question for you, an additional small question is, how geopolitics influence the choices of governments in issues such as using centralized or decentralized apps?
I think this is not only a question of geopolitics, but also a question of culture. In Asia, there are different cultures in America or in Europe. So geopolitics is influenced by culture, and of course, we see, as I said before, in Asia, very centralized responses. But very centralized responses also in a kind of public-private partnership. It's not only a centralized response only of the government for the public administration, they cooperate. So maybe, and we can discuss it later, maybe this is the winning system for the moment, at least in innovation, and maybe also in science. I say at least in innovation because they apply science. They apply science to basic problems. And so they are organized more or less in missions, right? For instance, China have said recently that they will promote and they will recognize researchers in base of the practical contribution to real problems. So this is a fundamental also shift in how science is managed.
Key part of this collaboration thing is academia and researchers. As you might know, Spanish researcher Camila Troncoso was the one developing the DP3C decentralized approach that actually inspired Google and Apple to develop their system. So I guess it's important to also include that in this collaboration group. But anyway, we will talk more about that later. Moving now to the information issue, Kathleen, how are both misinformation and disinformation spreading during the coronavirus pandemic? Has the pandemic accelerated it as it appears to be? How can your work on dynamic network analysis help us to both understand and fight this worrisome trend?
Hi. So disinformation and misinformation, and we also call them influence campaigns, during this pandemic are rampant. They're everywhere. They're on every social media, every news site. They're in satire, fake news sites, blogs, etc. Compared to prior disasters and elections, both of which are hotbeds for disinformation, the number of storylines and disinformation stories associated with this pandemic are significantly higher. There are hundreds of these stories that are out there and more appearing every day. They range from ones that are kind of more or less meant to be funny, such as drink Corona beer and you will not get coronavirus, to ones that are absolutely lethal, such as drink bleach and you'll be cured, to ones that are conspiracy theories, like this is a bioweapon. There are hundreds, like I said, of these different stories. Now, in contrast, in prior disasters, you would usually see maybe half a dozen disinformation stories. And in most elections, you see anywhere from a dozen to maybe 50 disinformation stories. So we're talking about significantly more stories. The second thing that's really different is that often disinformation is very local. It is intended for changing and affecting the people in a particular city or state or country. With COVID-19, not only is the pandemic global, the disinformation stories are going global. We're seeing the same stories, same disinformation popping up, in China and in Brazil and in Hawaii and in Paris. So they're all over the place. It's a global phenomenon. The other big difference is that we see more people calling out these stories as being false. We see more platforms like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook actually taking down or removing stories that contain disinformation. Despite all of this, these stories keep resurfacing at a rate, that is basically unprecedented. We also know that 66% of the people spreading disinformation on Twitter, for example, are bots. We know that these influence campaigns are being orchestrated in many cases. And, as to who is involved, it's actually really hard to say. But our work in this area using dynamic network analysis, as well as utilizing artificial intelligence, is helping us understanding who and is spreading the disinformation, what types of actors are spreading it. Is it coming from news agencies, or is it coming from random everyday people, or what? It's helping us better understand motivation. But importantly, it's also helping us understand who is actually being impacted by the disinformation and to what extent that impact is lasting. It's helping us understand what needs to be countered and how to counter it, because not every disinformation story is going to do harm, and not everyone needs to be countered. So it's helping us understand how to modulate our resources so that we can better help people through understanding what information is credible or not.
I was just emitting the micro. So I was wondering who, from your analysis, who is being more impacted by the misinformation campaigns?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of this disinformation being directly sent to and impacting ethnic minorities in countries, women. A lot of it is being directed toward women. A lot of it is being directed toward the LGBT community. So it's actually being used to actually build divides in countries. And so there's a growing worry here that this disinformation could actually make countries on the whole less stable because it's being directed at these minority groups.
That's really worrying. And I was wondering, last question for you is how can we use this information, this analysis, to fight this disinformation pandemic?
So partly we can use it to understand when do we need to fight it. The second way we can use it is since there is a movement to try to remove this kind of information, having better ways of detecting it that are more strenuous and based on science is actually helpful. And also we can use it to actually come up with new countermeasures. For example, we actually have been able to show that in some cases, actually calling out disinformation is sufficient to stop certain kinds of disinformation. So this actually helps us understand when to do that.
That's interesting. Okay, so I have so many questions for all of you, but I think it's better that we move to general questions for all four panelists. I'm not expecting you to answer all of the questions I'm gonna ask, but perhaps you could try to summarize as much as you can in your response. Anyway, we have a bit of time yet because we don't have Elizabeth with us. So my first question is, will COVID-19 boost responsible digitalization of economic and governance structures, or instead force digitalization based on unsecure technologies that don't ensure privacy and state government's control? So who would like to answer? Xavier. Yeah, sorry, I didn't see you.
Okay, I think that this pandemic is a kind of a huge accelerator. Things that should happen in 10 years will maybe happen in 1.5 years. And so we'll have to, especially from the democratic point of view, to build new things to counteract many other things that could go against democracy. So today it is said that aggregating data is aggregating power. And in fact, today it's basically big corporations, big digital corporations, and totalitarian states. The first for money and the second for power. Who is going to grow and to take profit of this crisis? I don't know, in fact, who is going to take profit of that or take advantage. Basically take advantage. But if you see the figures, for instance, in the big digital corporations, are earning, even gaining financial value. For instance, Microsoft, I think, has increased its financial value in about 46% during last year, considering the crisis. Apple about 50%, Amazon about 20%, Google also about 20%. So, and what about the data of the Europeans? Our data is in hands of American technological companies. Now, we have the challenge and the opportunity, and I would say the obligation now to create our own democratic data structures. We need democratic data strategies and structures, basically to support the common goods from the democratic point of view and the common well-being. It is our obligation, and this is our opportunity now, just now. Can I answer you?
Honestly, would like to answer this question. I have related questions actually. So okay, I will go on. So Xavier, as you said, I relating data, relating power. Going back to the contact tracing apps issue, you said like it depends on for countries it depends on their culture and other things. In Europe, we have seen different approaches. Well, outside Europe, we have seen the UK, who is taking a centralized approach, and it's being very criticized because it's not clear what they are gonna do with people's data. Because at the beginning they would say they were aggregating data, and data were personal data was being anonymized, but then that's not it's anonymized or how it's gonna be, and they might also recollect the information and use it later for research purposes. And they also said they might give the information to third parties, even if at the beginning they said that they were not going to do that. And in Europe, we have France, who has at least from the moment, they prefer a centralized approach, and the other countries in Europe that have said something about the preference are showing more interest for the decentralized approach, because there are other concerns raising as having the social graph of a person and using the information for other purposes afterwards. So as you said, we need democratic data structure. So do you believe that because of that, the right approach is the decentralized approach that the EU is actually supporting?
I'm not sure. I think we need some kind of, at least some kind of European standard. I don't know whether you can say that centralization. I don't like the term centralization, but some kind of European standard, that an European approach. I think that, as I said before, Europe has not faced or has not approached the problem of data. Take into account that we have a lot of, I would say, concerns about our data if this data is in hands of governments, of democratic government in Europe. But now, as I said before, this data is in hands of American companies. What Google knows, for instance, about a politician in Spain or a politician in Italy. What Google knows, to say Google or to say Facebook, whatever, about a lawyer or about, I would say, a military guy. Probably aggregating data, they have a lot of power that they are not exerting now. But they have this data and they can obtain conclusions. Why not Europeans, to some extent, with some standard that, in my opinion, should be provided, or at least right by the European Union? Why not to have an approach to our data and to give our data, not in exchange of services, like in the case of Google, something like that, but in exchange of some kind of health services also, but public and democratic in this case, health or whatever that could serve for the common good in Europe.
Oh, okay, I'd like to hear the opinion regarding this proposal you have already suggested.
Thank you.
From other panelists, like Katharina or Kathleen.
So this is specifically in the context of contact tracing. There's so many different ideas out there with them that the data is actually not being held by anyone. It's not being held by the companies. It's not being. it's very temporary, and it's so encrypted that the only people who get access to the results are the individuals who've been near each other, if they happen to be using the same kind of tools. So I think that, well, I don't know what the right response is, and what I don't know what the right thing would be for Europe. I think that we really have to look at each of these apps differently, and I also think carefully about which ones we want to, promote within each country to meet the terms of that country's own governance structure, because they're evolving rapidly. The other thing is that I think what COVID should be teaching us all is that we have to get much smarter about, when we're teaching people how to develop these kinds of technologies, we're teaching them to think about governance and the human condition at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. So we were talking before with Kathleen that just disappeared, Katharina, I mean, that, like, to what extent is there a risk that technologies that potentially violate human rights, deployed under the cover of coping with this public health crisis, remain in the post-COVID world? Is it enough with civil society being aware of this and being worried about it, for that politicians to pressure them to not to keep these technologies later? Because history has shown us that is very likely that every technology developed now is gonna remain, is here to stay. And on the other hand, or additionally, will it widen the digital divide between the developed and developing countries, as we kind of we were talking about that before a bit?
So I would say that we can't just leave policies in the hands of policymakers, and that, in fact, there's a growing number of stakeholder groups in many countries that involve both scientists, journalists, policymakers, from every walk of life, because each group has something different to offer and different sets of concerns that need to be addressed. So I think we need to go to a much more involved citizenry in terms of deciding all of these things.
Where there's a risk that technologies can, to some extent, violate human rights, or the use of technologies can violate the human rights, I would say that we should depart from the assumption that I believe firmly, that technology is never a risk. A pencil can be a tool for writing, or a lethal weapon if I stick this pencil in your head. So, or an aircraft, for instance, can be a missile. We saw that with the strikes in 2001. It depends on the use of technology. So the real problem here, in my opinion, after this crisis, is the potential emergence of populism. And technology is also a weapon to combat populism. And we should, from a democratic point of view, see how to deploy structures to give more information to people, to avoid fake news, and to use all this data for the welfare, as I said before. As I said before also, this crisis probably will be a kind of a huge accelerator, and what we are going to accelerate a lot is inequality. So a lot of people is suffering now and will suffer more maybe in the next few months. Poverty, unfortunately, may be spread in an era of technological abundance. So the question is how to use this technology to solve all these problems. And for me, can you follow me?
Yeah, I was asking if you have an answer for that. How can use technologies or any other tool to reduce the digital divide?
Xavier,
Xavier? I think we have lost
his connection freeze.
Okay, so I would add that in fact technology can help you reduce the digital divide in various ways. And partly it's how you design the technology. Partly it's how you teach people to use it, and also where you let the technology be developed and how interoperable it is. So one of the great things we're seeing happening is that new technologies are being developed hand over fist in the global south, okay, and that many of those technologies may be better than some of the ones that have been previously developed. The point is to make them available and to get everybody involved in looking at the cross section of these.
I was Xavier.
Yeah. Sorry, I think I have some problem with the connection. I don't know whether this is the platform of my connection. Sorry, I don't know where you have lost the connection. And
no problem. You're back now. So that's very good.
Just to conclude, I think that this crisis, in fact, is a crisis of management. So this is not a fundamental crisis in terms of, for instance, natural resources, capital, debt, land, work, technology. The only problem is basically organization and how countries organize themselves, and if you want, blocks or continents, in order to solve this pandemic. And you have seen different answers, and we can evaluate which is the best response country by country.
Yeah, well, I was wondering if sometimes we are not falling into the trap of techno-solutionism. I guess that's it depends a lot. So to ask you one more question before we move to the question and answer with the public, with the audience. What is your roadmap for a better future? I mean, both of us, but Xavier, you were talking before about public-private collaboration, and how can that be for good, and it doesn't make us more dependent on a single big company. Katharina is back as well. That's
yes. Good. Hi.
Okay. Perhaps, Xavier is out now. Okay, Katharina, perhaps you can answer this question if you have.
I'm not sure if you can hear me okay. I don't think you can see me. I don't know why, but.
Yes.
We can listen to you perfectly.
Okay. I think one of the things that we should do is maybe to be a little bit more hopeful, because as part of this crisis, we often talk about a rising nationalism. And of course, that's true. And a competition between countries. And of course, that's true. But we've also seen indications of solidarity. And perhaps this is also an element where we can hook into and can start addressing this. So one thing I really have in mind here is, again, the digital divide. And we often talk about countries from the global south being hit hardest by the pandemic, but then all these things being exacerbated because of the digital divide, because of not being able to switch so easily to e-commerce platforms, etc., etc. And of course, there is a question here of international solidarity addressing this. And we've been talking for a very long time about addressing the digital divide. But the point is, it becomes really obvious that all the things we've been not addressing so far, all the things we haven't been doing on an international level or on a national level, but let me focus on the international level, are coming back to bite us. It's kind of this question of, that was mentioned before, we all know that these kinds of pandemics are happening on a regular basis. They have been happening. So in a sense, we've only been waiting for such a pandemic to happen at this scale, yet countries were largely not prepared enough. And the same is true on an international level. So for example, things like addressing the digital divide gets new urgency through a crisis like this. And similarly, so we have the Sustainable Development Goals, and working towards the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, will help us to be better prepared for the next crisis. And I know I sound like pretty utopian and wishy-washy, but this could be something we should be working towards, because all these goals, as for example, the SDGs we've drawn up, if we had pursued them more profoundly, we would be better prepared to face a crisis like this. And as we all know, even if a Western country in particular doesn't suffer as badly as, for example, a country from the global south, these issues are essentially issues for everyone in a globalized world, and one way or another we will have to deal with them together. So that would be one issue, one point. And what do we learn? How do we go forward? What is the roadmap for the future?
Very good point. Kathleen and Xavier, would you like to add something? Xavier, I don't know if you were listening to that question. I will just.
Yeah, I listened to the question. I think we are shifting from years of market fundamentalism to another paradigm that is some kind of techno-nationalism. So none of them are good. We should, and especially Europe, we should rethink Europe to be in the middle. And it will be very, very difficult. But in my opinion, the starting point, again, is technology. And basically R&D, investments in R&D. More and better R&D, oriented R&D to solve citizen problems. I think this is only the way that we can go on advancing and more European integration. I know that it's very difficult to say now when Italy asked for help, no country in Europe helped Italy. It was China that sent certain help. So I think it's not easy. Maybe this is our last option as Europeans to integrate ourselves and to focus on what really matters. That for me, so a lesson of the coronavirus is that what guarantees our survival is technology, is science, and also what guarantees our wealth in the next few years. So for this reason, I think this is our obligation to try to integrate us more and to focus on what really matters.
That's a good message. Thank you, Xavier. Kathleen, before we move to the question and answer.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things we're seeing happening in the disinformation part is that a lot of the disinformation is being spread with the intent of creating divides. And so, and it's also often spread with very political intent. So either to create divides or to make a particular group stand out as heroes. And I think that we need to think about this measuredly. And I also think that if we bring in new technologies to help with this, we have to beware of becoming too devoted to allowing for the fast technical solution. So, you know, machine learning might seem really, really great and very helpful, and it is very great and very helpful, but it's not a panacea that is going to solve all the issues we're talking about. We still need to get many people actively involved and paying attention.
Yeah, for sure. So it's time for the audience now. I have a selection of questions here from the public. We actually had a question from a long time ago when we were going to organize this session at the beginning a few weeks ago. It was a question that was sent to us via Twitter from, I don't know if she's here now, Joanna Zwiatowska, which is she's a cybersecurity expert. And she was asking, how does geopolitics and cybersecurity? Perhaps Xavier would like to answer, or any other one in the room.
I think I have tried to answer it before. I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but the world will be divided, and there is not a single divide. I think the most important thing to answer your question is to make a diagnosis, and I will not answer the question, but I will try to do the diagnosis. The world will be divided, and will be divided at least in three big divides. For me, three big divides: East-West. So probably China, United States. This accelerator will create a bigger China, leadership from China, while maybe the states are declining, and probably will have a kind of iron curtain, new iron curtain. So we will have two digital economies, two 5Gs, two internets, two scientific systems. We will be divided. And maybe this is the most important divide that we will have after the crisis. The second one is in Europe, the North and the South. The North has catch up the Industry 4.0 paradigm, has understood what is technology, has implemented their plan, while the South, still we are in the same position than 10 years before. And the third is in between countries, right? The inequality that digitalization is also creating in between countries, in each country in the world, between rich and poor people. So this is my diagnosis. I do not have the answer, but I think the diagnosis is quite clear for me.
Okay, thank you, Xavier. I have a question for Kathleen from Fernanda Mau. Who is benefiting from the spread of all this misinformation and disinformation news? Why now? I guess you answered a bit before, but perhaps you can elaborate the answer now more.
Okay, so we don't always know who's exactly benefiting from all of this. We know that some of the disinformation is being spread by people who are doing it just for fun. They're just jokesters. I mean, we've gotten cases of teenagers spreading this just because they think, wouldn't it be fun to convince people of something? We also know in other cases that they're being spread by nation states with the aim of actually getting other nation states to be in a less good position, like to increase discord within those states or to promote their own image of their own country as being, very, very powerful. We also see it being spread. Some other groups are spreading up for money. So you can actually hire companies to actually spread a disinformation campaign, and they will lay it all out and spread it and make money based off of it. Some of it is being spread to create panic and to lead to you buying certain goods, which again causes you to puts money into certain groups' pockets. So there's a lot of different kinds of reasons. As to why now, I think it's for different groups, different reasons, but basically a national disaster, a global disaster like this creates an environment where trust in institutions is already shaky and where there's a lot of things are open and can be changed through information and information campaigns. So it becomes basically a hotbed for trying different kinds of strategies that can improve, your lot in life or whatever, more than in just normal conditions. There's just more ability to make things happen strategically through information during a global disaster.
Okay, question answered. We're going to following question by Oliver Smith. He says, I would be interested to know if any government has published trade-offs that they are explicitly making in creating the contact tracing apps. It all feels quite opaque right now. And also related questions come from Jose Maria Fernandez. Why are societies so worried about governments having access to our mobility data when lots of corporations already have it, with even finer grain of detail? Well, I will answer this. We should always be worried about privacy, no matter who, and the fact that we have done it badly in taking care of our data before with these big corporations doesn't mean that we are going to have to allow everyone having access to our data. But anyway, I will get the speakers to answer this.
Mm-hmm. I think it's. Let me address the kind of the first part there.
Yeah.
It is obviously quite opaque. Maybe two interesting developments, just reflections from my personal national background, so to speak, from Germany. So we had basically a competition for applications and technologies to help address the corona crisis, all kinds of applications. Not many of them were contract tracing, but some of them were contract tracing. So I think this at least gave a public impression of inclusivity, of openness, but also this idea that technological solutions should perhaps come from within and should build on a local talent. And this goes back to a comment I saw in the chat, which is the question, what about local developers or national developers? So that's one point. The other point is the public in Germany is quite sensitive to questions about privacy, data sharing. And the second point, on the one hand, yes, we are super careless about sharing our data with companies. On the other hand, as soon as we're discussing in relation to the state gaining that data, the state collecting that data, everyone is, lots of people get very, very cautious. And so, for example, regarding the app that has now been delayed a bit, we had a huge discussion on whether it should be centralized or decentralized. The original plan was to have it centralized. And after public discussion and kind of a public outcry in certain circles, it has moved to being decentralized. But generally speaking, yes, I think there's lots of opaqueness, and I think that's the danger of reacting to a crisis, because you can always say, okay, we have to act quickly now, so we can't go through the usual channels, or we can't have a long public debate because we need to get the application out there, need to test it. So for example, in the UK, it was very quick to roll out and then to find a place to actually test the application already. So I think that's a challenge, and I think there should be a pushback. And again, we need to draw the line very carefully between emergency response and longer term issues. And obviously the other point that's at play here is how do we actually weigh different rights? So how do we weigh the right to life against privacy? How do we even start? And I don't think that's an easy question, but it's basically in the background of all these discussions, because on the one hand, you could say, yes, of course, the state needs all the data it can possibly have because lives are going to be saved. On the other hand, you have a right to privacy and lots of other things. So I think that's exactly the issue here that we need to discuss. From my perspective, it's basically civil society that has to do a lot of work and has to do a lot of pushing, but in some cases with success, as I mentioned this example from Germany.
Let me say something regarding this dilemma of how to weigh right to life and privacy. In the case of contact tracing apps, this is a false dilemma because there is a approach, the decentralized approach, that lets you have your data, you keep them. They are private, but you also have the benefit from this kind of apps to improve or reduce the contact, the cases of coronavirus. So there is a false dilemma here that some actors are interested on like making true. I don't know. Yeah. Well, let's move to other questions. Liliana Arroyo has a question for Xavier. What kind of data infrastructure are you envisioning? Do you think national data centers are a solution? What about open data for common good?
I think, Liliana, this is precisely the thing. I think we need to build some kind of national data center, something like that, that should respond to common standards. I think that in technology, standardization is very important. It is related to the idea of centralization, but it's not exactly the same. So standardization in order to be able to understand in an automatic way each other, right? Because if not, we can create some kind of islands of isolated set of data. So I think some kind of more than national data centers, national data strategies for the common good. I miss it, really miss it. And the kind of infrastructure that supports, I honestly don't know. But first strategy and then structure.
Okay. On that note, there's an interesting point because, for example, you can look at the countries that have contract tracing apps in place or are planning to have contract tracing apps, and you can map that against these countries having national data strategies. And so you can see which countries have data strategies and using apps and which don't. But I think it's too easy to assume that because a country has a data strategy, it will follow that strategy, or in this case, we're safe from any kind of harm. I think we need to look a bit deeper on that note, because the strategy itself is not going to help, especially once the rhetoric of emergency or crisis comes into play.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think.
Yes, Xavier?
I think there is a superior layer to all this discussion. That is the layer not only of privacy but also cybersecurity, right? So all the things concerning to data are very sensible. It belongs to, I would say, national security strategy also at the highest level. So imagine, that probably you have seen, you have listened this discussion that if some kind of 5G is expanded worldwide, the control of your data could be taken for external hackers, right? So this is not only a question of privacy. It's much more complicated than that. Data strategy goes beyond privacy, far beyond privacy. So imagine a 5G network with driverless cars. All of us dream with this kind of future. But what if those cars, the control of those cars are taken from outside? So imagine the level of the problem. Again, this is not a question for me of technology, a question of science, it's a question of leadership. It's a question of leadership strategy. This is what civil society should ask for to our politicians.
Xavier, related to what you just mentioned, and Xavier and everyone here, we have another question from Joanna that I have realized she's here. Do you think that the COVID-19 might lead to the disruption of the current digital supply chains?
Absolutely.
Yes.
It happens. It already happens. Supply chains, well, you say digital supply chains. Digital supply chains have been disrupted in an unprecedented way. I think what's going to happen, and I have studied a little bit that is that as far as supply chains are every time more and more digitized, and they are more and more automated. They are less sensible to geography. So they are more mobile. They can come back, right? Because they do not depend so much on, for instance, labor cost. Second, if you are manufacturing value-add products, the cost of the transport over the product is very low compared to the price of the product, if this product is an innovative product. So again, those kind of products could be moved, could be exported from a central hub worldwide. They are not so dependent to be very close to final markets. We can produce in Europe and export worldwide if those products are value-add products, right? It's what is called logistic density of the product. And third, some kind of digital technologies like 3D, for instance, 3D printing, are independent of the scale and independent of the localization. I can produce 3D printing, for instance, ventilators or whatever part or piece at the same price, at the same cost than in China. So again, every indicator is saying to us that, this in my opinion, supply chains will come back, especially innovative supply chains. And there will be a competition for attracting more talent and technology and advanced production capacities to advanced economies. I said that from supply chain to superclusters. I think it will become a super concentration of this kind of activities in specific hubs very close to R&D centers in order to speed up the innovation cycles. So Joanna, I say yes. I don't know what I say yes to your question.
Yeah, it's always hard to answer. I was just waiting to see if Katharina and Kathleen, they have an answer for this as well. If not, I will move on to the question. Yeah, Kathleen?
Yeah, I was going to say that we know that through social media and regular media that disinformation stories as well as various influence campaigns were actually directed at people doing certain things that led to panic buying, which actually then in turn disrupted the supply chains. So we actually know that it was an exacerbator of that.
Yeah, I think we all remember that panic attack. People going to the supermarkets and buying, let's say, goods for the look. We have another question from Laji Agoro. He says, in a technology developing countries such as Nigeria, where research and development efforts is given little recognition, how do you think the pandemic could be addressed on the long run? And what role does or can technology play in less technology developed countries?
I think it's a good question, but it's not that easy to answer.
Yeah.
Basically, for me personally, and this is obviously the particular perspective that I'm coming from, it comes down to international collaboration in a kind of supportive way, in a kind of investment in infrastructure, sharing of know-how, capacity development. And I think it's very important to develop scientific capacities. And I think in some cases it comes down to international collaboration to be able to do so in the first place, especially if you talk about bigger projects. They are usually always managed by consortia, and I think here's a huge potential for collaboration. In terms of COVID-19, of course, we've seen both examples. We've seen examples of a kind of run for who's going to develop the vaccine first is going to have a huge advantage because they can sell it to other nations, versus very global, very collaborative approaches to developing vaccines or anything else related to the coronavirus. So I think it's crucial. I think for me, it personally comes down to collaboration.
Yeah. Thank you. So now, and for this, I will move to the last question.
So I completely agree. I think collaboration is, in fact, large-scale cooperation. Also, it's an obligation. Yuval Noah Harari, the Israeli historian and philosopher, say that what makes us humans precisely is the capacity to cooperate at large scale. And he says, for instance, that this is not possible for other species, like when, for instance, bees can cooperate, but not in a purposeful way, or apes can cooperate, but not at large scale. So it's very interesting, this view. And we also will overcome this virus in a kind of large scale cooperation style. I think for less developed countries, they need to cooperate, and we need to cooperate with them. But also, again, investing in R&D, very important, because it has a multiplying return that is very, very fast. We've seen that in Asia, again. So South Korea, that is now our reference, was poorer than Nigeria 40 years ago or 50 years ago. So again, creating this institutional framework and investing in R&D in the long term, not in the short term, of course, but in the long term, can make real miracles.
Thank you, Xavier. So the last question here. Manor Arthur asked, how are governments taking the social, we have talked about this before, but yeah, more in depth. How are governments taking the social disinclusion being caused by this increased use of technology in the education sector, and especially when it comes to social protection systems in light of the ongoing pandemic? And in other words, can the massive use of technology from governments hinder inclusion and advance inequality? What can be done about it? It's a very wide question. Yeah.
So I think this is a great question. That we actually are worried that governments will be bending over too much to utilize unproven technologies without thinking about them, and the technology companies will be putting out solutions without having fully tested them that could be very dangerous. So, for example, some of the early things that were put out to actually start removing people from social media were spreading disinformation actually ended up removing legitimate news agencies and government actors, and because they appeared like they were talking about disinformation when what they were doing was calling it out. So we have to be very cautious about this. And also, a lot of the technologies do have biases built in there, not intentionally, but just because we're human beings who are building them, and without even realizing it, our own biases may get into our things, may get in there. So I might have a view that no one would ever, say that spread information about, ice cream as being bad, but that may be my view, but I may have pulled it into my technology. So they never count this. And then of course it could be. I think this is one area where we need to have oversight groups who really understand the technology, working with the lawyers, working with the policymakers, working with, the government, so that, we view the technology usefully, but with caution.
Someone else would like to answer this? Okay, so I think we can conclude this panel. Thank you all for a very, very interesting session. Thanks to the audience as well. I hope you agree that it has been interesting, and I hope to discuss more further these issues.
Sure, I'm confident we're going to have more opportunities to develop this conversation further. Thank you so much, Kathleen, Katharina, Xavier, and Esther, for this enlightening discussion. As we saw today, if we want to better address the current and future pandemics, we have to look to the role of new technologies and digital infrastructures. COVID-19 will pass in time, but our societies will have changed. Consequently, our governance structure and diplomatic tools need to change alongside them. A key ingredient of good decision-making is the availability of data, as it's been discussed today, insight into preventive actions, population mobility, and the spread of the virus can help health authorities respond more effectively to the pandemic. Yet today, leaders who make the hard choices are lacking consistent, high-quality data on key questions. Governments, companies, and research centers across borders should work together to harness digital technologies to provide reliable data, evidence, and information on global and national developments. At the same time, as it was pointed out, as artificial intelligence proliferates and data establishes itself as a key source of value in the years to come, protecting privacy and civil rights should be high in everyone's agenda, especially on civil society agenda. As it was pointed out as well, it is time to place responsible data use, digital transformation, and civic engagement on the top of the global agenda in our quest for progress. It is time to shape an inclusive and sustainable digital future. Today, this special series of our SciDip talks about the COVID-19 pandemic comes to an end. For the last 2 months, we have discussed the role of science and technology diplomacy in the current crisis, the European response to the COVID-19, the role of cities in global mitigation efforts, responses in the Iberoamerican region, and the threats and opportunities of new technologies being used. In case you miss any of these sessions, you can watch them now on our YouTube channel. Our SciDip talks reach a total audience of over 3,000 people from 72 different countries. It is clear that science and technology diplomacy is here to stay. While we start working on our next series of online seminars on other topics at the intersection of science, technology, and global governance, I would like to invite you to keep updated on our activities, events, and career and training opportunities by following us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram, and subscribing to our monthly newsletter at SciTechDiploHub.org. Let me take this opportunity to remind you that if you would like to get certified in science and technology diplomacy, applications for our summer school are still open. This first of its kind one-week course, organized by SciTech DiploHub, the Barcelona Institute of International Studies, together with other leading institutions, will allow you to build your knowledge and skills in science diplomacy and further your career into some of the topics we have been discussing in these online seminars for the last weeks. Thank you so much once again for joining us, and stay safe, and see you very soon.